This topic is a new one. So Barry has about fermentation based on the recommendation of Tony Ford. And I could not be more excited for this. As some of you know, I have a background in archaeology. What that means for me is I like trash. And one of the best places to find trash is along roadways. So I am really excited to hear about how the roads in this county developed over time, and hopefully to hear about some of the ones that have sort of faded out. Anyone's driven around and seen one of those ramps that goes off a road and you just think, huh, where the heck did that go? So no pressure, Tony, but I hope we get to hear about some of those old roads. Or I be Tony, I'm sorry. All right. So Larry Tippin, everyone.
All right, so thank you. So Rachel noted this isn't what we typically talk about. We talk about the little town, tiny town, bays and villages, and we'll probably cycle through all of them. We may start talking about some of those again. Some people said they like to do those. And Tony mentioned that we were talking one day about, I don't even know how this came up, about some of the roads and how they were developed. And I thought it was kind of an interesting topic to me. And I don't know, something interesting to me is going to be interesting to anybody else. But we're going to give it a shot. Okay? So just to tell you the idea from the Pioneer Trail to modern highways, we're talking about how some of the roads evolved and locally. And let's start out somewhat different. The surveyor's notes. I was in the state archives doing research on something else, and the archivist, I don't know how it came up, but he mentioned the surveyor's notes. You know, we have those. We scanned them. We haven't copied the surveyor's notes. And they're pretty cool, although they're really kind of hard to read because they're 200 years old. They're pretty faded. So kind of show you one of the first surveys we done of Putnam County, and we have the different people that surveyed or led the survey crews, mostly in 1819. And this dashed line is generally Putnam County, although we go a little bit over here, Mill Creek, of course. But it goes illegal congressional township, and it goes from north to south. And we're partly 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16 north, and then range 3, 4, and 5 south, or west, 3, 4, and 5 west. So these are some of our townships. And this is what surveyor's notes look like. They're almost impossible to read. They have a PDF file. You have a PDF. You can kind of zoom in a little bit more. And I tried to do that there a little bit. It got kind of difficult. But what they do is they survey these out. And this is, I'll just show you this one, because this is the one that's the 10 o'clock line. So this is 12 north, 4 west, which is most of Washington Township. And the 10 o'clock line, it's sort of kind of neat the way they did. They can only go east, west, north, south. So the east, north. And then they had to make like a triangle, so to speak. And the hypotenuse of the triangle came to 10 o'clock line. I just think it's kind of cool the way they did that. And I tried to clip out the date, and that didn't work. And that's why I ended up for that map before that. It was in 1819. Also, they have notes about what they observed. The waterways, the vegetation, the kind of trees, the kind of soil, and so forth. And yes, all is impossible to read. I apologize for that. And they talk about some of the trees, and the beech trees, and various kinds of trees. And I'm going to jump to 14 north or west, which is Greencastle Township. So this is a survey of Greencastle Township. And there's a lot of stuff in here about the sections of things. And then about 10 pages worth of notes on what they observed. It takes several pages. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. We see a little bit better. They're talking about beech trees, sugar maple, and so forth, willows, things like that. And what they saw, the compartments of the trees. And then when you jump to the 1879 Atlas, our first compiled history, they talk about those very thicker. And you think, well, somebody did a lot of work and find out where the trees, the waterways. No, they looked surveyors' notes. That's how they got this information. And you can see some of us, all this were the surveyors' notes. And the Greencastle 10 tip, they're talking about, the waterways, the creek bottoms, yellow poplar, black walnut, doing the same thing we just saw in the surveyor's notes that we could barely read. And then in the county as a whole, the county did the same thing. And it's important to note, so the county was originally a very dense forest. I mean, you could not hardly get through it. It was so dense. And different kind of trees, and again, the same sugar maple, peach, black walnut, poplar, so forth, that we saw these same things in the surveyors' notes. Now, why that's important, roads. So what they did was, when they did the survey, they did the old style train and lake. That some of you guys are familiar with that. And I know, Dwayne, you know what that is. But to do that, you couldn't just go meander around whatever was there. You had to cut the trees and make a straight line. And then what happened was, dense forest, you could get, through hardly. But you had a small path now at the township lines and the section lines. So the early settlers started to use that. Even though it was a very narrow path, we could at least get through it. And that became some of the early roads. And we can see that when we look at our maps. This is the Greencastle Township that we just looked at. And for instance, 200 North, which most people call it Bryce Corner, you can see this road goes almost all the way across on the township line between Greencastle and Monroe. And you can see a little bit of a road here, and there's a road between two sections that they had cleared and became a roadway. So you could kind of see that. And somebody asked, it wasn't so frustrating to get from Roachdale or DeRaysville, or rather to the east side of Greencastle. So you got to go south a mile, west a mile, south a mile, west a mile. You don't have a direct road. And that's what you're doing. You're following the roads this way, this way, this way, this way, so forth, so on. It takes a long time to do that. So we got some direct roads, so forth. But that's kind of some of the early roads that we're not. And then we had a lot of the early roads because of the post offices. So the early post offices were first in Greencastle, 1821, and then Blakesburg and Swanksville. You heard of Swanksville? Never really talked about that. But most of you heard Blakesburg. At least you know of it. And then those are the first three: Greencastle, Blakesburg, and Swanksville. Then you had Manhattan, Russellville, Putnam, and then New Baysville and Poplar Spring. You talk about Poplar Spring, it has an important role in the road. But there's a publication online you can find. It's Postmaster 1832 to 1971. That's what it's called. We're going to look at it in a minute. But anything before 1832, you want to find out the post offices and point the postmasters. Jeff goes to National Archives, and Tony and I went to Atlanta once, and we found the first three on the microfilm they had, and we saved it. And the post offices, the postmasters, we just talked about. And then you had to get the mail from one post office to the next. So what the postmaster did is they let a proposal for a 4-year term, and they define the mail route. And if you want to bid for it, you can. And you have that bid for a 4-year term. And the proposal is very detailed, very specific, what you do. This is one of the interesting ones, 1832, was from Greencastle to Mount Tabor and Gosport, or Bloomington, I'm sorry, to Mount Tabor, Gosport, Greencastle, 50 miles back once a week. And you started Wednesday morning at 5 a.m. at Bloomington, and then you got to Greencastle at 7 p.m. the same day. But it's a 14-hour day, 50 miles. And there were no roads. There were no roads. But they kind of explained what they did to get some of the roads. And then the next day, Greencastle back to Bloomington. And then you look at a current map, so you Bloomington to Greencastle, no big deal, right? It's an hour and a half drive, pop the car, go up 231. Well, they're 14 hours on horseback. And they went through Mount Tabor, and I'm familiar with Mount Tabor. It's right here. It's a little bit east of Steinsville on one of the early roads that went north to south, and then Gosport. And then they didn't hop on 231 because that didn't exist at that time. So they went up probably north through Quincy and Higgins Trace, I believe. That's where they went. They ended up in Greencastle through the forest. And some of them had to make long roadway, basically, or use whatever they had. These are surveyors' roads. Sometimes they followed the streams, and this is just kind of interesting. So I've researched the Long family, the two doctors, William Long and Robert Long, and the elder of the two, Wade Long, came to Maysville in 1834. And it's just said it's a dead of the weather, described the surrounding country as a howling wilderness. I just love to hear it say howling wilderness. Roads laid out, no way of getting from one house to the next. And to his patients hit a blazed path through the dense wilderness. And you need to talk about sometime he would go and then he really couldn't find his way back home. It was just so, just so much. So much thick forest and everything. Here's another one of my rail proposals, which I think kind of interesting. This is 1853, this is a little bit later. And they're going Greencastle by Grubbs Mill, Portland Mills, and then on into Park County. Grubbs Mill was a big community at one time, a little bit northwest of where Clinton Falls is now, in Clinton Township. And there was a gentleman named Grubb, and it had a mill. It was called Post Office was Grubbs Mill. That was his post office. And then you would go, try to picture some of the roads they would go through to get this route. And then another one, this goes back to 1833, kind of interesting for a couple reasons. So they're going to go through Terre Haute, Otter Creek, and so forth, and Dixon's Mill. Have you ever heard of Dixon's Mill? It's a Mansfield now. And Dixon's Mill, the mill was originally called Dixon's Mill, and that was the name of the town, the name of the post office, but it's now Mansfield. Greencastle, Danville, so forth, so on. Left Terre Haute every Monday, and then also in stages. I mean, they recognized this one by 1833, they're going to use, partly at least, the Nashville Road on stagecoach or other stagecoach. So they had a map of a road in 1833, you could use a stagecoach. That's what they mean by stages. And then this is part of that. And then a different one from Greencastle, 2 words, by Blacksburg and Swanksville, Crawfordsville, 29 miles and back, once a week. Some of these they did it 6 days a week. Every day was Sunday. And a lot of them were 1 day a week. And so talk about Swanksville, this is kind of reported early in an early road. So there's a cemetery called Skillman. If you go 236 west side of Birch, and you go south just a little bit, and then you go west on 236 again toward Russellville. And you can see, because this is 1864, you did not have 236 yet. And there's a road that came up from Blakesburg and is on one of the Romeros. It went through Cairo and Swagsville, which is the second post office in Humboldt County. And there was a gentleman named Swank, Daniel Swank. And he's buried at the Skillman Cemetery. The Skillman was a son-in-law. It should be called the Swank Cemetery, but Skillman's the biggest, most prominent stones. They call it Skillman's Boku, but don't know any better. Then it went up to Swanksville, then ended up going to Parkersburg, then on to Crawfordsville. So that was that road. And then there's another road that comes in here. So this is the dividing line between Franklin and Russell Township, the green portion of Russell. And this road starts at that line. And I don't know why it didn't go into Franklin. And I don't even know for sure this was actually a mail route road at one time, but it was an actual road. And it went across, not quite a mile, going west. And then it took a sharp turn. And where number 12 is, there's a deep ravine right now. And you cross it at the Blakesburg to Swagsville Road, the mail route road. And then it continued on a little bit. You can see that road. You can see that road today. Where this driveway is the Franklin and Russell Loop Township line. So to go 236 west from 231, you look to the north. Be careful because
How did you ever find that?
well, I don't know. I'm going to show you it. I'm going to show you it. Well, one thing I knew was on the map, and I knew the general location. So you see this tree line that starts, right? And it's going west. Going west. They're telling you I went and took these pictures the other day. I've been passing this road. And you can see this. I'm going to go the other way, west back east. It looks like a fence row, right? It's too wide to be a fence row, and you could tell that it had been graded. And some of these roads have been graded and leveled, so you could get your stagecoach or whatever, I guess. I don't know. And then as you go west, just before that steep ravine, it comes out on 236. And you can see it. You can see that road. You can see where it comes out. I could take you to it, and I could point that road. So to me, this is just really fascinating. And then it comes on 236, and then it comes up past the Swank Cemetery. It's kind of like or the Skillman Cemetery, called Swank. And then this road, you can see, this is the one that came out from Blakesburg and crossed what's now 236, the Romero. And then we saw earlier that went up here near the LaFalle Cemetery and then Parkersburg. But that road's gone now. It's a field. But at Skillman Cemetery, just west of that, you can see where it was graded to go down to Swank's Mill, outside Mill and Record Creek. And that's where his post office was, the Swanksville post office. When Swank came, he wanted to call it Greencastle. So he applied for your post service. Well, you already have a Newcastle. You gotta do something else. So let's just call it Swanksville then. That's how it's got his name. And then you can see this road goes a little bit north. Well, that's a driveway of a home now. But that was a road. And you can see it. I mean, if you're looking, you can see the roadway. It's fascinating to me. Fascinating, but you can see these roads. You're seeing them now. In some cases, you can actually see the road. All right, jump a little bit more. So here's a discussion of creating a post office, or it's post roads. Bainbridge, Popper Spring, Blakesburg, Russellville, and then Park County. And then this is the 35, hard to see that. And so I kind of pulled it out. There's the 1835. And then they followed up with that and said it did pass the bill for several new roads, and that one of them was that one. So Danville, Binding Maysville, Bainbridge, Poplar Spring, Blacksburg, and Russellville. So Poplar Spring had a post office for just a short period of time, and then overlapped a little bit to Bainbridge's post office. So they actually had one in both locations for a few years, few months actually. At Poplar Spring, then Bainbridge, you go up the road to the north, and you could go to the right, or you go east or west. But if you go east, and then you go the Bainbridge Roadster Road, North Putnam School's about in here now. Just off of that corner, they call it ABC corner. They call it ABC corner. It says Albers, Balk, and Capelwood, I think. Three of the prominent early settlers. So we call it ABC corner, Maywell. And there's a huge cemetery here. It's off the road, party get to. But we generally call it the Piercy Cemetery. He was the most prominent person there. But there's about 200 people in this cemetery, in the middle of the woods. Middle of nowhere. And then it went, from here, it went to Blacksburg. So it's another map that shows Poplar Spring here. And then it crossed Ramp Creek 18 times. I counted it, 18 times. On the way toward Blacksburg. And then apparently it was easier to get in and out of the waterway. And then you're familiar with the Ramp Creek. It's it's shallow. It's not very deep. And it's easy to cross. And apparently that's what they did. And you see,
My grandpa lived on Ramp Creek. North of that I think is now County Road 800, but you agree on a Chris Creek.
was it?
And he would have lived along that and where the road was.
So somewhere in here, south of Carpentersville.
Yeah.
I've been south of Carpentersville. So that's where the road was. So these roads, even though they're postal roads, anybody could use them. I mean, there's no prohibition. Now, there is one thing though. So these people are carrying a mail, you saw that these proposals, very specific dates, time, anybody would know. So if you tried to rob somebody that's carrying the mail, the first offense would be 10 years in jail. And there's no third offense, because of the second offense, they found the nearest tree and hanged you. And I saw some places where they did do that, where somebody did try to rob the mail, and that was it. There was no third time. Sometimes it wasn't even a second time. Very serious that you could do that. But anyway, and then when it hit where 231 is now, it's kind of interesting. Right where I'm pointing out, one is there's a cemetery called Pickle Cemetery. And you can stand in that cemetery, and just below it, you can see what you're familiar with the Oregon Trail ruts, right? Talking about the Oregon Trail ruts where the wagon trains weren't so long they kind of rutted. Well, there's something exactly like that there. You can see it. I mean, if I'm standing right, pointed out. Well, somebody's building a home now, right from that cemetery, but you come out where that hits 231, you can see where it comes out. This is a driveway, basically now. Went a little bit south, and then went west again. Is what was Herschel Asher's place. Maybe it was Herschel long gone now, but it went this driveway, and then it went south of Brant Creek. The road now, of course, goes from Greencastle to Blacksburg up here, but the first road was south of Brant Creek. And there's a few places down there where you can see that it's been graded and lowered. And what's interesting about this, there's a cemetery here. Somebody started their people after they quit using inroads. So this is the early Lakesburg Cemetery. We call it the original Lakesburg Cemetery, actually. There's only two legible stones, a corner and a moss. We call it corner moss. But you can just see how that was leveled and graded. I mean, you can tell. You stand there and you can see where it's graded. So some of these are early roads that were made originally by Postmaster or the Postal Service, but also the public started using them and so forth, so on. All right. Different road. This is in 1831. So that's early. So George Piercy, he was probably the most prominent person in Bainbridge area at that time. He lived what's now Poplar Spring, or what was once Poplar Spring. They're going to make the Indianapolis to Montezuma State Road. Indianapolis, Montezuma State Road. And then we have a real interesting story in 1970, when the band arose. Somebody reminiscing about the Van Dever family. There's a Van Dever cemetery just off Highway 36 near the Park County line. And they're talking a little bit about the Van Dever family and so forth, so on. And then they talk about who this was on land later owned by the Copp elders on the end where US 36 was located. So what happened was, is several different places, a local settlers could have a inn of what they would call an inn of some sort, just nothing more than a room in their home, probably sleep on the floor, go down to the cellar, get your out your keg, give a traveler a meal, something to drink, maybe a place to sit, right? So they call these inns, even though they're not what we think of an inn now, or cabins. And some of these roads came to be known as tavern roads because they really were connecting post offices, but then kind of later we've known them to connect the inns or the taverns or have tavern roads sometimes. So this was an inn on what's now US 36 near the Park County line, where it goes north to Fulton Mills. I don't know the exact location in this inn where it was. I could find that. But this is interesting to me. And another map. 1876, I ended up pointing out Poplar Spring, where it was, and then the Grand Creek Road and so on. It's interesting here. There's a cemetery at Bridgesville in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I've been to it with permission. The Longhorn family, they own it now. And it's real hard to get to. But it's kind of, why is this cemetery in the middle of nowhere? Well, if you look here, you see a road that stops. A road comes up with stops. And right about where the stop was the early residence of pioneer Henry Crow did, one of the early settlers of the county. But you put two and two together, and you see the road looked like this at one time. There was a road there. You could stand at that cemetery and you can see the road. You can see where it was graded. See it went down the hill toward 37th House. And there's a road that goes to a certain point, kind of dead ends on the back side of Thursday Evans' farm. And Mike Waddler and I one time were out there looking at it. And he just thought that was so fascinating. But anyway, that's why that cemetery is built over. There's another one that's about 3 miles southwest of Rosedale on originally the Brown farm. There's a house called the Brown House, which is an old brick house. It's got to be Christian years old, and it's still usable. Somebody lived in it. But in the woods behind that house, Brown family and others, there's a community cemetery. There's about 60 people there, not like a small family. And it's in the middle of nowhere. Why is the cemetery in the middle of wood? Well, like Laura Scott would say, it's on her farm now, the road went right by it. And you could see the road. You could see it was clear. So sometimes where these cemeteries in the middle of nowhere, you got to think, was there a road here at some point in time? Sometime like that. But sometimes a farm a family that just buried a few people on the farm. It's just wherever. But if you have a fixed cemetery, a big community cemetery, it was probably a road there one time. And then we talk about the tavern roads. Some we've talked about. So I pointed out some of these that we've talked about. Originally postal roads, but then became known as tavern roads. I think a better picture of this one. Where that road starts that I was talking about, you see the Franklin Township side, there was no road. But there's a kind of another road over here where this one started when we went by the Skillman Cemetery that I showed you the picture of. Kind of weird why not start right there. All right, so it's different. So 1835, the engineers on the New Albany and Crawfordsville Turnpike for survey, and they talk about the abundance of stone as far as Greencastle. So there's a lot of stone in various places, other quarries. So this is apparently going to be a gravel road. So it's 1835, and this is early. So I'm kind of summing some of these things up. So the main north-south road in northern Putnam County to Blakesburg, Cairo, Swanksville, and Parkersburg on the way to Crawfordsville served as a primary road into the New Albany Crawfordsville Turnpike expression, which was about a mile and a half east of that, which is now 231. And then in 1927, the Department of Transportation, they're numbering roads. So they made that State Road 43. And then in 1955, they overhauled the numbering system and renamed it US 231. So once you think how, and Bladesburg died out. It no longer existed. It was no longer on the main road. And this is something I'm talking about getting off topic, but I'm not. So in 1869, some of the early pioneers who were getting up there now in age decided they should write down their memories and recollections of what it was like when they first came to Putnam County. And they did. So once a week in the Bear, in the spring of 1869, they'd have recollections of early settlers, number 1 through number 11. And it's really worth it to read this. Go to Hoosier State Chronicles and track this down. It is so neat to read these recollections, early settlers. This one is thrown to us because of what by Higgins Trace. So, any of you ever heard of Higgins Trace? Jane, you know anything about Higgins Trace? You know anything about it? Okay. I see it from time to time come up, and I've been trying to figure out where's that. And
I know who the Hazelett was.
I'm sorry.
I know who Hazelett was.
Yeah, you know Hazelett. Yeah. So he, in the recollection number 7, in April of 1869, Hazelett said this, and this is a direct quote. This said, "My father Samuel Hazelett came up from Rowe County, September of 1824, obviously an early settled. And he moved his family, all the goods here on back horses, following, I believe, Butlin's then called Higgins Trace, which is nothing more or less a path winding through the woods, which had been blazed out by some pioneer at random, so forth, so on." Well, how a trace came to be. Have you ever heard of a trace, a buffalo trace, or things like that? How they came to be is the animals would make a path through the dense forest. And then the Native Americans would follow that path, sometimes because they're hungry and they want to get one of the animals for dinner. But then they would make a little bit wider path, and then the path became a road. So we have several instances we have a trait that developed that way. And Higgins Trace is one of them. And I thought I had that figured out the first time that he continued to say, soon after that, what I might call the Indianapolis Greencastle Road, he's talking about all this, a bit I'm quoting it. which basically went from Stylesville to Greencastle. And I thought, oh, that's Higgins Straits. And now I read it again, and I think he's talking about a different road. It's about Higgins Strait, and then also this road. But if you look at it, trying to find Higgins Strait, there's a Higgins Creek and a Higgins Schoolhouse in northeastern Coverdale Township. And there's a kind of a winding road that goes up, partly because it's following the waterways and so forth, and Higgins Creek. That may be Higgins Straits. I don't know. Or it's great continue talking about what's not 240. You see how windy this is? It's not following, these township line roads that we talked about, that the surveyor played out. It just kind of went wherever. And that was probably a trace at some point in time. I don't know, this is Higgins Street. And it almost sounds like when Hayes was talking about it, it's a north-south road coming up in Bloomington. And I think those first Toastmasters were talking about coming through Bloomington, Mount Tabor, and Gosford. At least partially came up through Higgins Straits, I think. Where was that? Anyway, that's all I know about it. I wish I knew more. Let's jump and talk about the National Road. A lot of history about the National Road. So come to Putnam County, but originally it was scheduled to go south of us, and we almost missed it. I'd say what happened. So when Iowa became state in 1803, there was no good way to get there. I mean, literally no good way to get there. You know that the federal government was financed by the sale of lands to various settlers. So you'd sell land for $1 an acre, $1 per acre, or whatever. And that's how the government's finance. Well, they weren't going to be able to sell any land in Ohio because they couldn't get people there. I mean, there was no way to get there. You could go across Cumberland Gap and then kind of through Kentucky and up that way. But you really wanted to hear it. They needed to do something. So I probably put way too much information and I quoted it. But what they did, they passed federal legislation to set aside a portion of state lands in Ohio to build a road to get to Ohio, to get the people of Ohio. Almost like makes too much sense for Congress to use something that's actually logical, but that's what they did. And they called it Ohio 2% Fund, and they did build a road. Good road. Yeah, get some radio. It started in Bridgeport, Ohio, which takes across the Ohio River from Wheeling, in West Virginia. So you could take a ferry across to Bridgeport, Ohio, and then you connect the Zane Strait. The Ebenezer Zane family had a trace that went from Bridgeport, Ohio to Zanesville, and then went south. And went south past Chillicothe, which is the first capital of the state of Ohio. And then later, of course, moved to Columbus, the middle of the state. So the legislatures from Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri had lobbied the Congress to set aside funds to extend the Cumberland Road west through the new state capital in 1825, Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, and on into Illinois, Missouri. And that's what they did. Council legislation 1825. And they talk about appropriating $50,000, and they set aside a couple of people that are supposed to supervise this. Well, they drew a line on a map from Indianapolis to St. Louis, and it was going to miss Putnam County in the south. It was going to go even road counties, actually. Well, what happened was, when they got to the Wabash River, they could not get across it. There was no good way to get across Robert's swampland. I mean, there's just no way could there be a road here. So they had to move it further north. So they surveyed in this area. And then I've read the surveys. It's so interesting. So they're complaining about the hot weed dozer head, and it's rainy the whole time. It's just interesting to read them complaining about it. But they actually went north of Greencastle, and then they found out that wasn't going to work. And one of the biggest problems it had, the line was going to go just south of Greencastle, and there's too many hills to get like to the Burn Cemetery and Hot Breeze and all that. And they couldn't get across Deer Creek. So you're familiar with Big Walnut Creek, it's about as good as bad anywhere else. Try ported. You could just, make it work. But the limestone in Deer Creek, you couldn't do that. They had to find a place that could get across Deer Creek. So they ended up in the Putnamville area. It was not Putnamville. And that's how we got the National Road extended to Putnam County. And then there's a very specific way the road's supposed to be built. And they actually contracted with people, use a local, to build the road a mile at a time. So you could contract for 1 mile and build the road. And you had very specific about cutting the timber and so forth. And in the middle part of the road had to be rubbed out. But on the sides, it could just be cut just high enough that the hardwood wagons could get across it. So the middle part of the road became a muddy mess right away. So they started using the grassy area to the side, and then it became a muddy mess. And some parts you couldn't even get through it. It was just bad. There's even some places where we see where they actually went into the woods outside the road to find someplace. And then it's just impossible to get through. And you had to ford the streams originally. So the National Road came through in 1829, where you had Manhattan, Pleasant Garden. Pleasant Gardens was platted by John Malkin, who came from the area of Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. The interesting story about how it got its name. And then Putnamville, Mount Meridian, which is a road like Carthage. But Carthage wanted a post office. Well, there's already a Carthage in Indiana. So they decided, I don't know why, because they picked Mount Meridian. So you had the town of Carthage with a Mount Meridian post office for many years. And some of the old timers still call it Carthage or Old Cap. And then Westland. By 1833, the National Road became so difficult to travel. There's a Scottish engineer named John McAdam who had pioneered a method of making a better roadway. So it's crushed rock, fairly big for a base, medium sized, and then smaller size at the top, basically making it an improved gravel road. And all of it had to be smashed by hand. So that's another reason I went through Pleasantville, because it had all the limestone availability. And they called Macadam or Macadam, I don't know how to pronounce it, road. Then it became a gravel road. And then they started building bridges for the first time in 1833. And the newspapers, they had the specifications for the bridges. I mean, they had to be exactly this, exactly that. And then, I don't know, throw away too much to read. You just want to, I've got all this in my book, by the way, that we just published. So if you want to read more of the details about the National Road, that's kind of interesting. They're very specific about how to do the bridge. Just painted with 2 coats and an overjet. So it was just very interesting. And they told it, by the way, if you don't follow the calculations, you don't get paid. You have to follow a special case of DACA, or you don't get paid. And then in 1925, the National Road, and then US Highway 40, when they decided to start numbering the roads, and they built. And then it went east to New York City. So they started at the Cumberland Road in Cumberland, Maryland, because that's as far up as you could get on the Potomac River and have a deep water fort, so to speak. And over there, you had to go over land, but you could go down the Potomac to the East Coast. And then they extended it later to New York. And then they started to construct I-70. And I remember when I-70 was built. I was young, but I remember it. So just south of the Helping Cover Bridge, I knew somebody, I don't know how I knew somebody down there. My brother and I walked from the Helping Bridge down to where they're building the bridge over the road over I-70s. It was kind of neat. And then, along the next road, you had hotels, motels, Stuckies, a lot of Stuckies. You remember the Stuckies, of course. And then when I-70 came through, that all died out. Then now it's a local road. It's neat. It's got 4-lane local roads. Kind of nice. But it got that. But it used to be the main road. And then the Ocean to Ocean Highway. So if you ever heard of the Ocean to Ocean Highway, the Pikes Peak Ocean to Ocean Highway organization was formed in 1914 in St. Joseph, Missouri. And the idea was they wanted to get the East Coast to the West Coast as direct a route as they could. You had the Lincoln Highway and other roads that kind of meandered here and there and everywhere else. It took forever. It took 1914 in the Model T. It would take weeks to get from one coast to the other. So they used a more direct route. And they talk about the Pikes Peak Ocean to Ocean Highway organization, so forth. Again, that St. Joseph, Missouri. And then it went through Dayton, Annapolis, Springfield, Illinois, using as much as they could existing roads. And one of them, and this became US Highway 36, originally Pikes Peak Ocean to Ocean Highway. And an interesting article in the Bears, 1922, said Ocean to Ocean Highway passed through Groveland, Bainbridge, and Morton, its way west. The length of the county is about 21 miles. This thoroughfare has of late been lying like a lot of newspaper articles because the rum runner were using it. And that's why they said the newspaper article. Using an REO speed wagon. REO speed wagon was a very sturdy, fast, dependable car. You could load them with all kinds of freight and outrun the revenuers and lower police. That's what an REO speed wagon was. And you see that in people all the time. It's really about that. Then in row 1, where US 36 came, the Ocean Highway came through. It didn't go directly from Groveland to Bainbridge like it does now. There was a proposed Indiana and Illinois Central Railroad, which was going to be developed in the early 1870s, led by Judge Addison Locke Roach. And it was going to go through Groveland, Bainbridge, and Morton. And they did some leveling and bridge developments in various places. And then the company went bankrupt. So Judge Rhodes resurrected the idea and built Annapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad about 8 miles north and went through Birchdale, we know as a B&O. But they had abutments, like where the bridge abutment on 36 between Groveland and Bainbridge. They used the abutment that was made for this railroad to construct the highway. Originally, went from Groveland, Bainbridge, the Groveland Cemetery, House Cemetery, went across Davis Camp Bridge, and meanders and wandered and everything else. In 1932, they made a more direct route. Then they called it the Henry Palm Memorial Highway. And then that's how that came about. That's it. That's all I got.